Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the show. Now, if I mention the word cyber attack, then you've probably got an image in your mind of what that means, likely formed from a movie or TV show. But in reality, cyber attacks can come in many different forms and be perpetrated for a variety of different reasons. A logical solution to this complex landscape is to invest in more systems. But as my guest on this episode explains, there's a far more effective way that we can manage cyber risk. And that is to think less about systems and more about humans. As she explains, behind every cyber attack, there's some kind of human motivation for doing it. And when it comes to protecting organizations, the biggest single weakness is humans on the inside. My guest is Sarah Armstrong-Smith. She's the Chief Security Advisor at Microsoft and a leading expert in the cybersecurity space. She's also the author of a brilliant new book called Understanding the Cyber Attacker Mindset, in which she explores the human dynamics behind cyber attacks. In other words, why do the people who launch cyber attacks do so? If we can understand that, we can start to focus on the root cause of the problem, which is humans. Of course, speaking to those who perpetrate cyber attacks isn't easy, which is one of the reasons why Sarah's book is so fascinating. She's also great fun to speak to. What you're about to hear are some fascinating insights about how human risk manifests itself in cyberspace. I think there are some lessons for us there in managing human risk in other contexts. So please enjoy my conversation with Sarah Armstrong-Smith on understanding the cyber attacker mindset. Sarah, welcome to the Human Risk Podcast.
I'm so delighted to be with you. Thank you.
I'm thrilled to have you here because you're someone that I have been following and engaging with on social media for some time. It's an absolute pleasure to meet you, at least virtually. But before we get into talking about your book, can you tell my listeners a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Sarah Armstrong-Smith. I'm a Chief Security Advisor at Microsoft. So what's one of those? So in essence, my role is to liaise with Microsoft's largest enterprise customers across Europe. So this is multi-sector and multi-country. Tends to be CISO, CIO, CTOs, that kind of thing. Really understanding challenges when it comes to cloud adoption, digital transformation. But the real big thing is cybersecurity in its full context, in essence. So all shapes and sizes or all types of risks that we're talking about. But my background, in essence, I've been at Microsoft just over 3.5 years, but I go back all the way to 25 years, sort of. But I actually come from a business continuity and crisis management background. So that I kind of pivoted into cybersecurity. So I always describe myself as being on the business side of cyber. So in essence, I think a lot of the time cybersecurity is all about how do we protect infrastructure? So how do we secure the cloud, endpoints, that kind of thing. But I always bring it back to people and the data. So what really are we here to protect?
Wow. Which of course makes you the perfect guest for the show because we love talking about people and what drives them. And I guess to do what you do and to have that perspective, one of the things that is interesting is when one thinks about cyber is often, to your point, one is thinking about the equipment, the tech, as opposed to humans. What is it that's prompted that human side of it? Is it you've always been interested in people and then come into cyber, or was it a realization? What prompted that?
Yeah, if I go all the way back to being a kid, my dad was in the Royal Air Force and he worked in psychiatry. And when I was kind of like 6 years old, we were living in Germany and it was the end of the Falklands War. And there were soldiers all coming back. And I really saw the difference. After school, I used to go and play in the hospital like you do. But I also see the real difference between those people who were coming back with physical injuries and those people who were coming back with mental injuries. And so PTSD was a relatively new concept at the time, but it got me really interested in all the things that you don't see. And I kind of from there, I ended up doing a psychology A-level, and then I didn't really know what I wanted to do, and everything else. But the people aspect has always been there with me. And even when I left college, my very, very first job was actually working in a fraud department for a vehicle management company. And my role was to put cases together, in essence, for people committing fraud on fuel cards. And it's very interesting to me that even way back when, that even people committing fraud, they don't even realize they're committing fraud. So if I give you an example, if you can imagine companies who have fleet cars and they might have a company car, you then have a fuel card, you will leave the company, you give your car back, but you keep the fuel card because you're just like, oh, well, hey, I get free fuel. So I got to put fuel in my car, my mate's car, family's car. And then you're like, no, it's fraud. You're actually stealing that money from your company, in essence. Sometimes they didn't realize it. Sometimes when you actually say that's committing fraud, they're like, oh my goodness. Some people just don't care. But it's that kind of that reality that people given a chance might just kind of commit fraud, in a sense. And it's like, wait, so then I pivoted into business continuity with the Millennium Bug, but I was always been on the front line with multiple major incidents, flood, fires, pandemic, uh, IT failure, anything you could imagine, really. But even being that close to major incidents, it was always about the people. Let's not forget why we're here and why we're doing the things. And I just had a really simple motto, in essence, was people first, always. And I can't tell you how many times I've kind of seen a business continuity plan, crisis management plan, cyber incident response, but any one of those. And people kind of comes third, fourth down on the list. So you might have financial impact, operational impact, and people are kind of somewhere down near the middle or at the bottom. And I think that's very gives a good perspective on how you view people and the culture of your organization. And I have to keep reminding people by you doing that, you're basically saying that you value profit over people. And as soon as you say that, like, oh no, my goodness, no, 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 that's not the case. Well, I said, but unless you have people right at the very top, and they are your first priority, no matter what the incident is, your mindset is always in the wrong place.
And I love that articulation because actions speak louder than words, as we know. And so people would never say the most important thing in this organization is anything but our people. And yeah, you're right. That's often how things are organized. And I think sometimes it goes beyond that. You've got to actually be thinking about real humans in the real world, because often we come up with, what I like to describe as how we would like people to behave rather than how they're likely to behave. And so
Yes.
we need to recognize the realities of the humans that we have employed. And that is to say that they're not always behaving logically. They get tired. They have other priorities. And so when we're thinking about both how they are likely to react when things go wrong, but also the fact that they might be distracted, that they've got a million and one other things going on, and that some of the things that organizationally make sense don't necessarily land with them. We're not walking into the office or logging onto a system and thinking about all the dynamics behind it because we've got a job to do. And so we're focusing on that. And so there is often, I think, even in organizations that are trying to do the right thing with regard to people and prioritizing that, miss that point that we've got to be thinking about real human beings.
Yeah, very much so. And I think, as say, I think a lot of the time it's still very much focused on technology and the data, but actually missing the point that it's the people that make the difference ultimately. And just because you will something to happen or you write in a policy, then you just assume it's going to happen because, well, you're doing your 30 minutes of e-learning once a year and that's it. That's all you need to do. But, but I think it's that it really just kind of goes to show you, I think a lot of the time, people don't spend enough time on the people element. They just assume it's going to happen if they will it to.
I mean, it's almost like plug and pray, right? But it's for human beings. It's like, well, we'll just put these things in place. We'll put a policy there. We've done the training, job done, right? It's
Yeah, yeah,
as if
you're
as
right.
if it's almost ironically as if you're programming machines, right? We'll
Yes,
just do the logical things that we need to do, and then the job's sorted.
very much so.
You've recently written a book which is out early in 2024, and so tell us about that because it's got a fascinating title that grabbed my attention as soon as I saw it.
Yeah, well, it's understand the cyber attacker mindset. So in essence, just looking at the humans behind the attack and understanding their will, their motivation, why they do what they do. And then ultimately looking at what's the strategy, what's the so what. So in terms of counteracting the human, I think a lot of the time we kind of get obsessed, particularly with cybersecurity, as you sort of say, we talk about the phishing, the malware, the ransomware, 0 days, all of these things. But that is just a means to an end. That's just a method of attack that someone or some group is utilizing to fulfill an objective. And it's really there. If I understand the objective and I understand the will of that individual, then I can kind of counteract the will. So what they do and how they do it, there's a myriad of methods that they could utilize to get access, but it is about getting access in essence. So they don't really care how they get access. And then it's kind of then what are they after? So they're potentially after the data, but it's then considering what is the value of that data in different hands. And then it's kind of then working backwards to see if I understand the actor and I understand the motivation and I understand what they're going to try and do with whatever they've got hold of, I can counteract that. As some of that might be technology, but what I'm trying to actually get people to do is really fundamentally think about the process, think about the people, and really understand if they really truly understand the people risk as well as the organizational risk and things that have to kind of change as a result. So if I park the attack a bit just for now, and if we then look at the people element inside the organization, as you were kind of talking about, and why do certain attacks work so well? So if we look at phishing, for example, I saw over 80% of all cyber attacks start with some kind of phishing, email, text message, or whatever. And the reason they work so well is because they are manipulating that person. And the reason why any single one of us can be manipulated given an opportunity. So you could be the janitor, the CEO, everything in between. Given the right circumstances, any single one of us can fall foul to a phishing email. And this is why they cast the net as wide as possible, because it could just be, as you say, I'm tired, I've made a mistake, I've got other things going on in my life. Any one of these, I can just click the link. And it's as simple as that. But that's what they're relying on. They're relying on the fact that you're stressed. They're relying on the fact that you're tired. They're relying on the fact that some people just don't care. So it doesn't matter how many times you say, don't do this, don't do that, but it doesn't matter. And then what I then try and challenge people then is do you really understand your people and do you really understand your organization? Because I said, like, how you think things work and how they actually work are two completely different things. So then I kind of look at the fact that you've got shadow IT, shadow processes, what you're tracking and monitoring. There's no resemblance to what the actual process is because people have just created a process to make life easier, to bypass controls, to do all the things that they need to do. And that's what the attackers then take advantage of. So you're monitoring the wrong thing and you're not addressing the underlying problem. So I talk a lot about culture and really kind of getting to grips with that side of things. Because if we understand our people, we understand our culture, we understand how they would try and manipulate someone to get access in or get something out, we would then be able to counteract the attacker. So part of it is understanding our own organization, and the other bit is understanding the attacker itself. And the two then kind of come together. Then from the attacker's perspective, I then look at kind of different types of attackers. So you've got the opportunist, activists, organized crime, nation-sponsored actors, and the insiders as well. And I think what I'm trying to then look at is it's a kind of a myth to assume that they're all financially motivated. Some of them want kudos. Some of them just want to be part of the group. They just want to belong, in essence. Some of them are financially motivated. Some are motivated by wrath, envy, jealousy, any one of these things. And sometimes when you kind of then look at how and when they started, some of them started at a very, very young age. And again, it's how impressionable they are, how much they've been manipulated as well. So that's where I was trying to get to, is really kind of understand those people, those groups, why they do what they do. And I think then if we can understand that, we can bring the two elements together. We can bring what we know about attackers and what we know about our organization, and then bring the two together. You can then overlay that and understand where you are vulnerable. So some of that vulnerability is in the humans themselves. So what are you doing to protect those people? And it's just, I say, that security awareness training, one size fits all, e-learning, phishing simulations that try and catch people out. You're no worse than the attacker. in essence.
I want to come back to that for a thing, but I love this idea that if I took what you're saying to the physical world, and let's think about robberies or burglaries or something like that. What you're suggesting there, when people focus on the technique that was used, is it's almost like saying, well, lots of windows have been broken, right? So we need stronger windows, and we're going to focus on the windows. And what I think you're saying, correct me if this is wrong, is to say, yeah, of course, right? That's the manifestation
Yes.
of the fact that I don't know, let's just say the window, it looked tempting because somebody had left something inside the window that was tempting for somebody from outside. And also the fact that if you understand why they're breaking in, you can solve it. The problem isn't just the window. The problem is
Yes.
actually the bigger picture. What are the human dynamics that underpin this? Because if you just fix out the windows, I guess you'd end up with sort of quadruple glazed windows and lots of shutters. Right. And to your point, all that would happen is that might stop that particular entry point, but actually they'll just go somewhere else. And therefore we need to be looking for the root cause of this thing. And if we can understand the dynamics that are happening that make us more vulnerable from both sides, and that's purely a human dynamic, if we get that, we're making ourselves much more resilient because we're not running behind the last way that they found in. Because as you say, humans are creative on both sides. So employees are constantly trying to find ways to make their lives easier. And let's assume that they're not malicious, but of course there's that element as well. And then criminals will also do the same thing. So I love this idea of you're saying, forget that the window's important, but let's have a look at what is actually going on here. And if we can understand the rationale for trying to break in the first place and why that might, then we can start to really solve the problem. And that's a much more intelligent way of doing it. And the bit that amazes me is we do that in so many other contexts where we would do that for physical crime, but the police thinks in those terms. And yeah, for the area that you're speaking, we don't do that. We focus on the window.
No, exactly. And what I'm talking about as well is to really understand the inside out and the outside in. I think a lot of the time companies are focused on the outside in. So how do I prevent all of these attacks from coming, as you sort of say? So I've got a window, I've got the doors, I've got networks, I've got all of these things. But actually, I need to understand what all the inside looks like, how my organization has been deployed, what my people look like, where's the data, how attractive is that data. And so I get really annoyed when kind of people say, oh, well, the attackers know your business better than you do. And I'm like, how? How can that even be? That is physically impossible. And I think if that's the case, we should be employing them. So I kind of like look at it because, yeah, you need to understand the outside in. If you don't understand the inside out, something is very wrong with your business. And that's why I challenge people into understanding what is really core to the business. What are the kind of the processes? What are the people? What ultimately are we trying to protect? And then kind of working backwards. And I think that the amount of money that people spend on penetration testing and, all of those things, I think that's great, but that should be to validate what you already know, not to kind of prove how big the holes are. You should already know where the holes are based on what it is you're trying to protect from the inside. And I think, you can kind of go to most organizations, say, what's your crown jewels? What are the core assets what ultimately are you trying to protect? Oh, I don't know. And they'll always revert back to servers, endpoints, cloud, without really kind of considering the value of the thing that's actually in your organization. And what makes your organization ultimately is the people. And so to your point, there's a million and one ways I can get in, and there's a million and one ways that I could force a law. If I'm that motivated to try and get in, so the more barriers you put up on the inside, I'm just going to go to the person on the inside instead. Why would I waste my time trying to break into the window or break down the door or do all these things? And if I'm trying to get into the inside, I will use the human. I will manipulate them to give me what I want. And this is where I come back to culture. So if you have a very poor culture, when most people have kind of got to the point where they're just fed up, don't care. Someone's going to offer me a little bit of money to turn a blind eye or to download some software, click a link. I don't care. It's not my problem. And so you can kind of see some people might be manipulated into doing something unwittingly. Some people will just do it anyway because it's why not. And so this is where I talk about the culture of the organization being so important because, as you sort of say, you can't will something to change. And you can't kind of just turn around and say, oh, I'm just going to change the security culture, because that's not how it works.
You reminded me, I love that. I've seen it so often. You get sort of posters where, uh, insert whatever you like. Security is everyone's responsibility, right? And you look at this and go, well, what am I supposed to do with that? Right? Well, that's literally you've just abdicated responsibility and kind of said it's your problem. And I'm like, I don't know what you want me to do. And I love this idea of just kind of like, well, we'll just tick the box, right? If we just put up some motivational posters and send people on the train, go, it will happen.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And I think it's a problem. It's like, well, security will change the entire culture of our organization. It's like, not you're fighting the culture of your organization. That's the problem. So your culture has to be kind of changed from top down. So, but you have to acknowledge the fact that if you have a really bad culture, if you have a blame culture, if the minute that something goes wrong, if you're calling people the weakest link, repeat offenders, anytime something goes wrong, it's a stupid user's fault because they clicked the link, they did this thing, sent the wrong email out, and that's how you talk about people, then your culture is fundamentally wrong. And that's where you're introducing the problems yourself because the culture has enabled all of these things to happen and manifest in the way that they do. So it's like trying to move an oil tanker in essence. You can't just, first of all, you have to acknowledge that we have problems with our culture. We have problems with how we think about people, how we think about security, how we even think about compliance. And so first and foremost, you kind of have to accept that. And with all of the kind of flaws that come within it, it's okay. But as a company, as a whole, what needs to change? And I would say most of that is an organizational cultural problem. And it's not something you can easily change, but you have to change it if you're going to change have any chance of actually changing the cycle. Because otherwise you're just repeating the cycle over and over again and expecting a different outcome.
And the thing I think is really interesting about the way you articulate that is if I sort of let my mind wander and I think to some of the business practices that are out there, keep costs as low as possible. Right, we can make a load of people redundant, get people. Well, we've got staff. They can just work a bit harder. Type logic. And what I think is really interesting is I can make all sorts of ethical arguments that why you should treat your people well. But actually, you've pointed to a really strong commercial one, which says if you run your people ragged and you treat them like they're idiots or you're exploiting them, in crypto's pissing them off, right? Then actually, here is a way that they can get back at you, either intentionally or accidentally. But either way, you have a problem on your hands that will hit your bottom line and is disproportionately, when it goes wrong, it goes badly wrong, could put you out of business, actually. And so what I think is interesting here is that this is a link through to why you should be good to your people, hire high quality people, look after them, reward them well, all those sorts of things, which sits outside the normal argument, but I think is incredibly compelling. Because as you rightly pointed out, every single, I look at it, I've always looked at it from a reputational risk perspective and said every single employee has the potential to embarrass you nowadays through their social media account, right? Do something stupid in the public sphere. One of the things that will interest people is who do you work for? And there will be a link when we've seen people getting fired for things they have said on social media that are nothing to do with work, but inappropriate on some level. But what I think is, but that sort of feels a little bit tenuous. But this is directly saying, actually, we need to be thinking really, really carefully about humans and the damage that they can do willfully or accidentally to us if we're not looking after them and creating the right culture. And I love that fact that you're pointing towards what I might term band-aid solutions, right? We have a gaping wound here. So we're just going to put a little plaster on top, paint over the cracks and hope that everything's okay. And that painting is the training or the whatever. So we feel good about it. It looks okay. But actually in reality, it's not. And so dealing with this issue you can't just do that. You have to actually make sure your whole business is built around it. And so I love this because you've produced a really strong commercial argument for why we should do the right thing by our people.
Yeah, and I dedicate a whole kind of chapter, and I've had some criminal psychologists and forensic experts and all sorts of things contributing to the book as well. And I spoke to Dr. Elizabeth Carter, who's done a lot of work on romance scams. And what she does is she actually analyzes how people are being manipulated versus the kind of the language that the attackers use. And she said it's very similar to almost domestic abuse in terms of the language that they utilize, what they're doing, how they separate people. Because when people are being manipulated, they don't know they're being manipulated. That's kind of the whole point. Because if you did take yourself out of the situation,
It doesn't come with a big thing. I'm about to manipulate you. Watch out.
yes. I think it's quite fascinating because you've made a really great point and it kind of comes back to how we treat victims. So how we treat victims of cybercrime versus violent crime, in essence, as well. So again, even if you're a person or you're an organization, you're stupid because you allowed the attack to happen. You were put yourself in this situation, and you would never do that if it was a violent attacker. You would never kind of sit there and blame the victim. You would always then say, no, but nobody sits there and says how clever the attacker was to be able to manipulate the situation and get what they needed. They will then turn around and say, I know how stupid the victim is for not having appropriate security, for not having appropriate policies and processes, for allowing this thing to happen. So I talk a lot about the dangers of victim blaming, scapegoating, and just looking for someone to blame, because that's normally what happens. It's kind of like, okay, even if you've had attack, you've had a data breach, it's like, right, we need to blame someone. And all the better if we have a scapegoat and we blame everything on that scapegoat, and then we say that scapegoat has now been disciplined or they've been fired. It just means we put everything onto that individual or whoever and we move on because the scapegoat's gone now. But that's just it's a figurative kind of sacrifice, if you like, and it hasn't changed anything. In actual fact, then the problem then is you just build that level of apathy. You end up having people who are going to end up whistleblowing because it's the culture is building up around this, and everyone else sees it. What's the point of me doing the right thing? Why should I call out that someone's done something wrong, or I see an issue and this issue's not dealt with in the right way for the right reasons? It's going to build and build and build and build. And actually, before this book, I wrote my first book was Effective Crisis Management, which is really having a deep look at some major incidents that have kind of happened over the last few years. So I looked at 9/11, Deepwater Horizon, even Colonial Pipeline, ransomware attack, some of these kind of big things. And in hindsight, I go, oh, how did this happen? How did an event of this magnitude happen? And I said, these things never just happen from nowhere. There's always been a build up. And I think that's another thing that's been quite fascinating to me is how bad does it have to get before you make a change? And I think if you looked at any one of these major incidents, and particularly if there's been like a public inquiry, and again, if you have a public inquiry, it's because you've had fatalities. You've had such a huge event that's manifested itself. But then you kind of even miss warning signs. You had audit reports, you had risk registers, you had people telling the board over and over and over. And you can kind of, again, cultural wise, if you've got CISOs or CIOs or, whoever these people are raising these issues over and over again, and you just kind of blindly push it to the side, you kind of, it comes back to the culture again. So if I get this report and it's telling me you've got a problem, what are you doing about it? Or you just kind of, throw it with all the other risks and issues, and I'll blame someone when something happens. So having written the first book, as I sort of said, it's really about you have to do something positive to make a change. Otherwise, you're just going to repeat the same thing over and over again. But as I sort of said, then having wrote that first book, which is then what does effective crisis management look like, this was then bringing it to life with then bringing it back to the cyber side of the fence.
And it was interesting you were saying the victim shaming thing, for want of a better phrase. I was actually, as you were talking, I was thinking, well, we do kind of do that in certain contexts. I said, well, we don't, but society does. Women who get raped who are wearing, so shouldn't have been wearing those clothes, all those sorts of stupid things. They ignore that. So there is, what's interesting is we port that, sensible people know that's not dealing with the problem, right? That what people are wearing or how they're behaving or the way they look is irrelevant. It's actually the problem is on the other side. And yet we port that obviously ridiculous logic from that context into this one. And so I think it's interesting because you're right. The tendency is, if we can fire all the idiots, then we'll be okay. Well, my contention is if you've hired idiots in the first place, then you're just going to hire more idiots. If you want to think through that logic, you're just going to hire more. You're going to have the same problem replicate itself again, maybe in a different way, but you're not solving the underlying problem. And so hence to your point, we look at the culture in its entirety and say, what we need is an environment that can withstand human fallacy, and recognizing that we can have there's this desirable state of I always laugh about traffic where they always talk about zero accidents. That is never going to happen, because even if you remove humans, right, machines screw things up. We know that. But I love this. So there's this fantasy land. If we could just get the right people, right, it would all be fine. And that's not the way it works. We need the right environment. And so I love this idea of this is a broad, what you're pointing at here really is it's a microcosm of a broader challenge that we have. Is we like simple solutions, and a simple thing is, particularly if you're a senior person, you don't want to take any responsibility. Let's blame someone else, right? And we'll fire those idiots, and then the problem's gone away. Actually, it hasn't. Potentially, we're just queuing up for it to happen again.
Yeah, I think sometimes the answer to the question is let's just buy more tools, more technology. And they just go kind of round that cycle as well. Like, well, that technology didn't work and didn't solve all my problems. So I need some more. I need a bigger one. And I think it's the technology is not the problem. It's the why you've bought the thing in the first place and how you've deployed it. But again, if you don't understand your business, you don't understand your people, you don't understand where those vulnerabilities are, and you're not consciously closing those vulnerabilities down, you're just going to keep repeating, in essence. So it doesn't make any difference to, what you're doing and how you're doing it, because you're just putting a bigger plaster over it.
And you mentioned earlier the phishing emails, which I think is really interesting, because I was thinking in other compliance, I'm talking about the fake ones, not the genuine terms, but the ones the companies send to their own employees. And I always thought that's really interesting, because on the one hand, I can see a logic that says, okay, what we want to do is we want to teach people not to click on these things. So how do we do that? Well, the answer is we put them in a realistic situation and we teach them not to click on them. And it's a great way, in theory, of assessing the level of risk we're running. Right? Let's let this thing out there, see what happens, and then we know whether we have greater propensity. Now, I think there's tremendous flaws with it, which is, one, just because somebody doesn't click on it one moment doesn't mean they won't the next. And secondly, it's perilously close, if not actually being entrapment and irritating the hell out of people, particularly if it's not followed up with an educative, by the way, if you've got something like this is what the consequences are going to be. It tends to be discipline for you, more training, and then you add in things like, the more realistic we make these, people think, oh, well, what we'll do is we'll fake an email from Amazon or something, without thinking about there's breach of intellectual property, right? All sorts of other dynamics that you're opening up there in your attempt to do this. And it always struck me that was a classic example of, right, oh, we can pin things on people, right? So if we can identify the idiots who are going to do these silly things, we can then train them out of it. Which we fundamentally know that is not how we don't. If we have a habit that, like alcohol or nicotine, whatever it is, right, drug addiction, we don't just sort of say to someone, go for half an hour training course, that'll get you out of it. We need to recognize there's a bigger picture here. But I think for me, that's a classic example of the misdiagnosis of the problem, thinking that's a great way to do this. And you can see the intellectual logic, but it misses that human bit at the end of it.
Well, I think people just get turned off to it. I'm just like, if you're trying to trick me and they're trying to get me, and as you say, you get the repeat offenders tag, and then you just kind of automatically, you've just labeled these people, as, again, it's a kind of like, oh, you fell for this thing. But it's kind of then, if you think about the safety culture of many organizations, and you then tell people, well, this is why you need to wear a safety belt in your car, because it's for your protection. So you're not just going to put them in a car crash to teach them about why you should have had they told you should have worn wore a seatbelt. Now you've kind of gone through the windscreen. I think that there is better ways of, putting people in situations and helping them learn than actually mentally torturing people, which I think is what they're doing. I think there's evidence of that people were caught out through COVID and things like that. And they were sort of saying, oh, when you think about the trauma that people have been through, and then you sit there and pretend that you're going to give everyone a bonus because of COVID and this, that, and the other.
Yeah.
And then you kind of touch, oh, no, that's I made it all up. And because you're deliberately putting people into that situation. And if I've got good culture and I'm a good company, why am I trying to actually stress my people out? I want to be in a position where people go, but you know what? I'm not sure about this message. I've got this email. I just want to, I want to check it out. And that's what I should be doing. I should be able to turn around and saying, they're being overly aggressive. They keep sending me messages. They kind of get me to do something I wouldn't normally do. Bob, can you help me? Can you just kind of verify this? Can you just kind of do it? Otherwise, we're just going to get to the point where I just don't care anymore. I'm just going to click it anyway. Not my problem. So what if they get in? So what if they steal your data? Who cares?
Right. And I love that. I mean, one of the ones that's always classically talked about is the sort of the particularly in smaller organizations, the CEO or someone needs something urgently, right? And then you get the so go and buy some gift vouchers. You know what I mean? Stuff that seems to me, right? In the cool light of day seems like how the hell does anyone fall for that? But I recognize that they're correct. But those things, to your point, those things only work where the CEO needs something only works in an organization where the CEO has a reputation or the organizational culture is such that people you get shouted at if you don't do things. If you've built a culture where you're allowed to question the CEO, right, that's the biggest single mitigant of the CEO needs X, Y, or Z. Well, you go, okay, I know in our culture it's okay for me to go double check, and it
Yes.
doesn't matter whether this sounds like an urgent request because we don't. So there's a prime example of it only works if the culture is toxic in your
Yeah,
organization.
exactly. And if you feel like, you know, what's the worst? I'm going to get bollocked anyway. So I don't know what to do. If I do or I don't, I'm damned whichever way I do. So it just increases the stress. So I'm not going to sit there and just give myself 5 minutes to think things through. And this is the kind of thing I talk about. If you're in this kind of culture where it's must win at all costs, and you must work like this 24/7 all the time, you're constantly on edge all the time. Or you are in that kind of culture where actually no, we stop, we think, we talk things through, um, and we kind of got that. Even if you've made a mistake, then what? Do you feel safe enough to say I've made a mistake, or do you just put it under the carpet and hope no one's noticed? And if you're doing that, everyone else is doing it. And that's where you get all the things that manifest themselves into a huge problem or a massive incident because everyone's just followed everyone else because that's the way we've always done it.
And that takes me nicely to your research book because we've talked a lot about the internal piece, and you could see how the research for the internal bit relatively, I'm not easy, right? Because you put a lot of effort into this, but it's an easier constituency to appreciate because we've all been part of it. We can see it internally. The thing that fascinates me is the research you did for the outside in piece because these are not, these are not generally people that we can go and chat to, and yet you've managed to do that. And tell us a little bit about how you went to get that perspective, because unlike the internal one, it's not sort of readily available from personal experience.
Well, first of all, it was important to me that I speak to people who are reformed characters, who kind of seen the error of their ways and are consciously trying to make a change. So one of the people I spoke to was Tony Sales, who is, well, the media dubbed him Britain's biggest fraudster, in essence. But he did in-person fraud. And then he kind of talks about his childhood and some of the issues that he had. But he then also talks around that we are still dealing fundamentally with human emotions. And he said, so that's what I'm pulling on. I'm trying to get you to do something, and I'm either drawing on it, hate or love, in essence. So the hate bit is in essence, so I'm manipulating you so hard and you're so scared of the consequences if you don't do this thing that you're going to do it. The converse of that is almost like that kind of romance scam that we were talking about is that you kind of fall in love with me. And so when I ask you to do something, you're never going to question it because you've built so much trust into that person and into the scenario, into that situation, that you're going to do whatever I ask you to do because I've built it that way. And so he said, fundamentally, no matter what I'm doing, I am pulling on human emotions and I'm using them to my advantage, which is, I think, very fascinating that everything that we're doing, everything we're talking about is the human. It's the human motivation and how much you're motivated to do that. So again, when we talk about the kind of the faceless crime, when he said he was committing fraud, he would basically take people's identity. So people who have very good credit ratings and utilize that across multiple shops to buy high value items. So get loans in essence in someone else's name, run up huge amounts of debt in that person's name. But he never saw the correlation between, he just assumed that that person would get their money back from their bank and everything would be fine, everything else. And he said it took multiple years when he finally faced the reality that is not what happens a lot of the time. And actually, he said some people feel so violated that they've had their identity stolen and their privacy has been violated to such an extent. It's worse than if you'd come in my house and stolen things. because there's always that kind of stigma that kind of goes with the fact that I can't get a loan, I can't get a car, I can't get a mortgage. And even if I try and rebuild my identity, there's always that kind of stigma that you did it. And he said, and he found out that a lot of people don't get their money back. Their lives have been completely destroyed. And so when having learned that, the correlation with the kind of the between the attack and the victim and the real impact, he kind of then changed his ways, in essence. But I found that quite interesting. As I actually sort of said, it really comes down to that deepest human emotion. And that's kind of what's driving you in essence. And then I kind of spoke to somebody who is an anonymous as well. And he comes from a different perspective. So he was an activist. And he had this kind of whole moral dilemma about social injustice, and having to kind of speak up for people who couldn't speak up for themselves. So he kind of thought he was quite within his right to attack multiple government agencies, defaced websites, stole data, put data out onto like dark web or whatever else. But he said, there was no financial motivation. I never sold any data. It was all I was on a moral crusade, in essence. So in any sense, so who's the victim? The organization, the government will say they're the victim. I'm actually think the underdog who I'm representing is the victim. And so because I had this um, kind of extreme arrogance about me. And he said, so, because he talks about the fact that you've got people who will physically chain themselves, to a building or something like that. So and some of those type of activists, and he'll say, so what's the difference of me taking upon myself, to then bring all these sites down to do DDoS attacks, do all of the things. I'm still disrupting the company. I'm just doing it from a different perspective, but I'm on a moral crusade. I have this deep need to make a change. And I think of all of the attacks and everything else that I've kind of looked at, there's a deep fundamental need that's driving them. So then looked at Lapsus, who was one of the fairly new cyber attackers. They ended up being British teenagers, and they just wanted kudos. They wanted the kudos factor. So they were kind of doing all of these attacks because I could, So there was a financial motivation there, but it wasn't all about that. They desperately wanted to make a name for themselves. And then you've kind of got organized crime who are very deeply financial motive. And they couldn't care less about who you are, what you're doing. Everything is all about the money. It's all about the end game. And what I identified from following this particular group called Fin7, they're one of the most notorious organized crime gangs in history that are kind of Russian and Ukrainian, is that they'd actually set up fake security companies and recruited genuine security people into that company. Those people thought that they had been employed to do penetration testing and to do phishing emails on companies, but they were actually they were defrauding them. These companies, they just thought they were employed, so they just didn't know they were part of an organized crime gang. And then so these are the kind of lengths that they went to try and get people, and they're going to manipulating them. And then right the way through then to some of the nation-sponsored actors, looking at Russia and North Korea, but also the strategic culture. So I spoke to somebody in the military, particularly when we look at Russia, and you kind of look at it through your Western lens, and you kind of look at, how do these countries do these things? I don't understand why people kind of follow them and follow the leaders. But actually, if you switch it round and understand that, again, culture, understand why their culture is completely different to yours, and why they might have a different perspective on things, and why they were doing what they do, why they have a huge wrath, let's say, against the US in particular, or the UK or Western entities, it kind of makes sense. So they're driven by wrath, they're driven by envy, and everything that kind of comes with it is got this deep fear, envy, wrath attached to it. And so people just kind of latch onto it. So I was going to say, it's very interesting to look at different perspectives, different groups. But fundamentally, there's the human motion that's kind of driving their desire and need to do something. But as I said, so their method is kind of irrelevant, whether I'm using a phishing email, malware, ransomware, 0 day. The only thing that really makes that different is how much money I have to spend. But they are still need to get a return on their investment. Because why am I going to spend all this money attacking this entity if there's no value to me in doing it? If it's got no way of meeting my objective, what's the point of me doing it? If it is meeting my objective, I'm going to do it more and more and more and more.
Wow. And so if I look at that, I mean, you've cited various different rationale. So back to the window. I mean, it could manifest like any one of those they could all use the same technique, just in different ways, but they could also use very different. So your point is really to say we have to identify what's sitting behind it to know what we're dealing with. And then we can start to think about it. And I guess what that points to is it's not one size fits all. You've got varying levels of professionalism, resources, guile, what success would look like. I guess propensity to keep hitting the same target as well, because the traditional logic is if you make yourself more vulnerable than your neighbors' houses, for example, then you're more likely to get burgled than them. If you are not a specific target, i.e., they don't care who they're going after, then that would apply. Then you just need to be better than the other. If,
Yeah.
of course, you are the target for whatever reason, then of course they're not going to give up, and then that's a different dynamic. And so I think that's a really nice illustration across the piece that not all motivate in the same way. I think sometimes we like to have it's almost like a cartoon villain or like a Bond villain, right? We like to have this one thing. If we can define it, nice and easy, job done, and that's what we're up against. But you've just rightly identified that there's a host, and obviously this is just a selection of the potential permutations, and there'll be, I guess, combinations of those things. And
Well, I
based
made it quite simple. So I really narrowed it down and I called it the 7 sins of attackers. So I really looked at it like down to the cardinal sins, if you like. So if you think about, Roman Catholic Church, they talk about greed, gluttony, lust, and as I say, wrath, envy, and sloth. Did I say 6 or 7 there? So like some of
no one will
them
notice.
narrowed
I
it
think you
down.
said 7.
So I narrowed it down to each of those, and one of those kind of temptations that you like, one of them will lead to something else. So if you kind of think about some attackers who are motivated by greed, and so they're financially motivated, but they go and see the amount of money that they're making, so that greed can turn into gluttony, and that's kind of where they start to make mistakes because they just do it over and over, and they get bigger and bigger, and they're willing to take more and more risk. And that's in essence is kind of what sort of Tony Sales was sort of saying is he got the taste for the money, the finer things in life. And so he was willing to take more and more and more risk to get these things. Until it kind of almost sort of backfires on you. But even like the sloth side of things, that's where the apathy comes in. And I kind of was linking that to some of the insider threat because one of the things I was talking about as well is the kind of the rise of the super malicious insider. So this is someone who absolutely understands the process. So they work in IT, they might work in security, they might even be the fraud manager, they could be the audit manager. But so they understand the process. They understand how to bypass the process, and the kind of that apathy that they have is I don't care. It's all about how do I fulfill my objective. So I know how you're monitoring, I know what you're doing, I know how you're doing it, I know what technology you deployed, and therefore I bypass all of the things. And that means I can still do all the things that I need to do, but there's that apathy there. I don't care. I just don't care anymore. And some people, again, will just join a group, whichever motivation that group has, because I have this need to belong. I just want to do something. I need to be with something. And I think it all comes down to that human nature again, of that human nature of needing to belong, to have society accept me. The problem is then normal society, if you like, in inverted commas, they don't fit in. They don't fit into there. So who do I fit into? I find this other group that I do fit into, or that group that is manipulating me to fit into that group. Because I think a lot of them that I found also they're very technically astute at what they're doing. So some of them start very, very young because, maybe they can't make friends. Maybe they've had issues in their childhood. And so the answer is, I'm just going to go in my room. I'm going to go online and kind of go. And then I end up joining this group, these subgroups. I end up on a kind of chat group with in Discord or wherever else. And I kind of one thing kind of leads to another, to another, to another. And I think a lot of it is a lot of the young people are being manipulated by other people into doing various things. And it just kind of spirals from there.
And it's interesting when you talk, because I kept thinking about parallels in other contexts. So if we look at cults, or conspiracy theory cults, for example, or knives, or drug cultures, or people who just like physical violence, so they join whatever protest happens to be there and to smash things up because that's what they enjoy. So all of the things that you're highlighting, none of them are surprising when we, and it comes back to you, this is the whole point of your lens, right? None of it is surprising when we think about it from the human angle,
Yes.
because just because there are computers and bits and bytes involved in this stuff, right, doesn't mean that the underlying human dynamics will still be there. And so really we need to start tackling this in the same way that we might tackle more visible things. And often this is, of course, invisible. That's part of the delights of it, I guess, from the perspective of the criminal side of it, is you're not physically going and smashing things up. You're actually doing things secret. You don't need to be on location. So hence you get, one, the distance that you talked about from the criminal to the crime. So if they do have any moral sense of things, they're not seeing it. But the second bit is a lot of these dynamics that play in the physical world is much easier to play them out in the digital world. And so I love this idea of really you're just saying, well, actually, if we step back and look at the human lens, we can bring in the analysis that we bring in for other things, for physical events, and then we can start to recognize the problem that we're facing.
Yes. Yeah. So I think if you think about where's the biggest vulnerabilities, your biggest vulnerabilities is in the humans in your organization. So I think that's where the biggest opportunity we have is to kind of make a difference. And that's why it all comes back down to culture ultimately. But I also sort of say is society itself has created this problem. I think that was quite an interesting dynamic that I had with another person who works with the police. They actually trained the police in terms of digital forensics and computing and various different things. So we said as a society, we've almost created this perfect environment for cyber criminals to breed in. Um, because like, what's the worst that's going to happen? Honestly, it's white collar crime. It's a slap wrist. Anything really bad going to happen to me? Not really. And that assumes that you can catch me. And I think that was a challenge that I spoke to some of the law enforcement, and they were sort of saying is like using your analogy of breaking a window. If you're in a physical crime scene, you're going to leave evidence. So you're going to leave fingerprint, footmarks, whatever tools
You
that
have
you
to have been there, right?
utilize.
It's
You're going to
not-
have cameras
yeah.
monitoring, hopefully the inside, outside, everything else. So for me to find that physical evidence and attribute that to a specific individual is how a lot of the police is kind of enabled in terms of, how we could kind of track a crime and attribute that to an individual. How I do that in a digital world is completely different. And he said, even if I was able to track you down to a specific IP address in a specific building, I knew exactly what time you logged on in this, that, and that, I still have to put physical hands on that keyboard. I have to, because especially if you have a shared house or something like that, I have to be able to turn around and say, it was 100% Sarah at that time of doing that thing. And I said, that's the bit that's really hard. I can only go so far from a digital perspective. But I still have to attribute someone to a specific crime to charge them with that crime. And so when you think about how easy it is then to actually work across multiple jurisdictions, and he said, and so not only do I have to prove down to a specific individual, I also then have to rely on the law enforcement in that country to physically do something about it. And so that's why they end up going to like Eastern Europe or, some of the African nations or something like that, because their laws are completely different. And some of those countries have got zero interest in going after them or trying to get them to go into another country. Okay, so it's just easy not to bother.
This is interesting because it's like traditional controls within organizations and the way one might think about doing things. Once again, it's a good example of we've outrun the systems that we have, which I guess brings us back to we've got to go back to absolute basics here. And what's the most basic form of prevention? Making people aware of what's going on here and trying to manage it at that level, because
Mhm.
actually all of the structures that we have put in place or that we might think to put in place, because again, if we don't fully understand the problem, then we're going to design the wrong things. And so that I guess points us all back to your start point, which is we need to be thinking about the humans.
Yeah, exactly. And it was really interesting to me. I spoke to an ex FBI agent as well. I mean,
You
he
have the
went
best
to,
conversation. I love this, right? Like, who gets to have these? This is super cool to just be able to chat to these people. I mean, amazing.
well, yeah, as I said, they're ex FBI, and he was tracking a specific group. And he said, the thing that's soul destroying for a lot of law enforcement and 100% attribute to a specific person, specific group, but I know I will never ever be able to extradite that individual from that country. So if I could go to Russia and I'll be like, yeah, can you extradite these people
Right.
to the US? Like, no, never, not going to happen. And so sometimes I know I can never stop them. And so what I have to then do is let them know that I know who they are. So it'll not necessarily stop, but it might push it underground. They might have to change their tactics and everything else. But I'm just kind of throwing, I have to kind of just chink away at it. Because he said, even if I had another 10,000 analysts just in the FBI, I'm still scratching the surface of the impact. And so kind of expecting law enforcement to fix a problem, expecting someone else to fix the problem isn't fixing the problem because they're still dealing with the aftermath. And I think so it all comes down to what are you doing specifically in your organization to stop them being able to get access in, manipulate the people, do all the things that they need to do. And as I sort of said, so your best opportunity is to really, really be cognizant about your own organization. As I said, the culture, the processes, acknowledging all the flaws, how all of those flaws could be exploited. And what are you going to do about it? Because as I say, otherwise we're just blaming everyone else for something.
I'm listening to you just thinking, wow, this is like one hell of a challenge. And I guess you have to be optimistic, right? That we can do something. I mean, you're not, it strikes me, you're not unrealistic enough to say we can eliminate all of this, but we could be much better as organizations and society at handling these particular problems. So I guess your mission, if I were to pin one on you, Sarah, would be to say, you think we can just do a better job of this, right? And so we need to understand the problem. We need to be realistic about the problem we're facing, understand the dynamics, and then come up with solutions to actually address it rather than things that just make us feel better. Is that a fair depiction?
Yeah, because whatever we're doing isn't working, is it? It's just getting worse. I think it depends on what stat you look at and believe. I think it was like cybercrime's an $8 trillion business, and that's just going up and up and up. And if you compared that to gross domestic product, they would be the third biggest superpower in the world, so behind US and China. And they are the fastest growing economy in the world. So for whatever we're doing, they are making a lot of money. And that's only those that are financially motivated. As we sort of, there's a whole group of people who are not financially motivated. And so, just we need bigger tools. We need, spend more money, do all these things. It's not working. So we're going to have to try something else ultimately. Because as I sort of said, unless we make a fundamental positive change and are willing to disrupt ourselves, have a good hard look at ourselves, we're just going to keep repeating the cycle. And I think that's the problem is it's easier to blame others than it is to have introspect on ourselves.
The thing I love, and I think this is intrinsic in your personality, is you're bringing this real cognitive diversity here. Right? This is on the one hand, as I've pointed, other contexts. This is logical. It's exactly what we do in other contexts, and yet for some reason we've missed a trick because it involves machines and
And
data. But what you're bringing is that fresh approach, and I love that. And I think it's a fascinating example of cognitive diversity because if we looked at as you say, the traditional playbooks are not getting us there. And so we need to open up a new one. Well, why not you just borrow from other contexts where we can understand stuff, but bring some fresh thinking? And I think that's the joy of listening to you is that you've approached it in a, it's not an alien solution. What you've basically said, and I mean this as a compliment, not, is actually let's have a look at the way we try and solve other problems and recognize those dynamics. And ultimately, there are human beings involved in this whole process. And therefore, let's just apply that here, recognizing what we're dealing with. And then we have a chance of fighting this thing.
yeah, I think it's really as simple as sharing and collaborating. As we sort of said, is if your whole premise is picking through the bones like vultures of anyone else that's been attacked and pointing fingers and everything else like that, you're not really helping the situation either. So actually, I think if you're in a mindset that we are going to be compromised, we are going to be attacked, if we are being attacked, we need to be as open and transparent as possible, but we need to allow everyone else to learn from it. So actually, let's just be really open. Let's just kind of lay it all out and not look at what all the things that we did wrong. What did the attacker do right? I think that's the thing as well, that we need to really have a good look at what they did versus what we did wrong. Because I think that's where we just repeat the victim blame and scapegoating otherwise.
Wow. Amazing. Well, listen, firstly, thank you so much for all the stuff that you put out there on social media, right? It's always engaging. It's always super interesting, always makes me think, as the conversation that we've just had has done. So thank you for that. The book reminds people what it's called and where they can get hold of it.
Understand the cyber attacker mindset, and from all good bookshops, hopefully going to be released beginning of March 2024.
And probably some terrible ones as well, but let's try and support the bookshops as well, because good books belong in good bookstores. Sarah, thank you so much for everything. It's been an absolute pleasure. I've learned some things. I've laughed a lot, and those two things together mean it's been an absolute joyous time. Thank you so much.
Well, very welcome. Thank you very much.
So that's it for this episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Sarah for appearing, and to you for listening. To find out more about Sarah, her book, Understanding the Cyber Attacker Mindset, and some of the topics that we talked about on the show, have a look in the show notes and you'll find links to those there. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. To discover episodes that you might have missed of the show, visit the show's website, which is humanriskpodcast.com. If you like the show and have yet to leave a review or rating for it on whichever platform you're listening to the show on, please do so. It really does help. I'll be back very soon with another episode of this show. But in the meantime, stay safe and thanks for listening.